So we are looking at dry acid grassland a little bit closer today. I'm going to go over, first of all, spend a little bit of time talking about what dry acid grassland actually is as a habitat, and then we will go through some of the indicator species, both some at the wildflower level and some at the indicator level. But also remembering that there is also a presentation available on our website under the online training page, available as a PDF or as a video to watch by Dominic Price about dry acid grassland that was produced in a previous year, where he goes into other species and not just the species that are listed as indicators. So some other species around dry acid grassland, particularly because he's quite known for his grasses. He goes into some other grass species as well. So NPMS lowland grassland is the broad habitat category, so that's where it sits within. And then we have the four categories underneath. So we have the dry acid grassland as the fine habitat category. We also have dry calcareous, neutral damp grassland, and neutral pastures and meadows. But for today's session, we are going to concentrate only on the fine habitat dry acid grassland. So first and foremost, what is dry acid grassland? So essentially, it is found on acidic, free draining soils, which usually maybe is overlying sort of like with underlying sandstone, igneous rock, sands and gravels. Now, sometimes when we mention this sort of underlying geology, it can seem a little bit abstract and think, how on earth would I know what's under the ground? But there is actually a really useful website called the British Geological Society, where there's a geology viewer. It's basically called the BGS Geology Viewer, or BETA. And that basically means that you can have a look anywhere in the country and see what kind of underlying geology you have for your area. And it can be really useful as an indication of what you've got there. We're talking about the lowlands. This is lowland grassland broad habitat, so it's lowland dry acid grassland. So that means that it's going to be found less than 300 meters above sea level. So we're talking about grasslands that are generally quite short and quite an open sward. Pretty much often dominated by the fine-leaved grasses rather than your big, coarse, wide-leaved grasses. And often these sites can also have a mix of lichens and mosses scattered about, and often quite a lot of annual species as well that are making the most of that open sward environment. You'll often find dry acid grassland as a mosaic with heathland and heathland species. So you might have things like heather and bilberry dotted about. This fine habitat also includes inland sand dune communities, which is not something that I've actually been able to see myself, but there are good examples in East Anglia, Wangford, Warren, County Down and Merlot dunes. So if anybody is near any of those places, they can be quite good as an example of an inland dune, sand dune community. So the key signs that you might have a dry acid grassland. So we've talked about those fine-leaved grasses. So species such as Bristle Bent, common bent, sheep's fescue, wavy hairgrass, early hairgrass, which is a difficult one. Not many people are aware of it because it is quite an early flower and it's quite small and it's an annual species as well. And red fescue. So those are all nice fine-leaved small grasses that you might find. They can be rich also in grassland fungi. So, you know, if you're taking on a square or a few plots just at this time of year, it can be interesting to go and see if you have got dry acid grassland, you know, maybe there's some interesting fungi there as well. You often get maybe stands of bracken in these places, and sometimes that's a part of the management that needs controlling, because obviously if you get a big stand of bracken, then that might dominate and you'll lose some of those grassland species. Quite typical herbs to be found in this kind of habitat are sheep sorrel, particularly. It's often kind of gives a characteristic reddish sort of haze across the surface of the grass when it's all flowering, because it's quite dense usually when it's flowering. So that's quite typical. Heath Bedstraw, lovely little white flowers, often very low growing. Tormental, common cat's ear, mouse ear hawkweed, tiny things like parsley peat. Common birds foot trefoil will also grow in these habitats, and common stalkspill is another common one. Now, this is not exclusive and these are not the only ones, but these are just some common species that you might find. As I mentioned, also things like lichens and mosses. So like cladonia species, like reindeer moss, you can often find that in amongst dry acid grassland. So it's important though to note that when you need to actually record in a different habitat category. So we mentioned about the heather and the bilberry, for example, as the sort of low woody shrubs. But if they cover more than 25% of your ground area in your plot, then you need to be recording at the dry heathland habitat. So because this kind of habitat forms a mosaic with dry heathland, you've got dry acid grassland, it really depends on exactly where your plot is going to sit as to which habitat you're going to be categorizing it in. And also, if your plot is actually more than 300 meters above sea level, then you're actually going to be wanting to record in the montane acid grassland category. And the dune community isn't considered inland dune, and maybe it's actually coastal habitat. So it's just worth double checking, you know, how close you are to the coast and what kind of plant communities that you have. So just to really sort of illustrate that sort of 25% element. So remembering that if it's over the 25% then of bilberry and heather, then you're wanting to record at the heathland category. Whereas if it's less, then it can be dry acid grassland. So just to reiterate that you can obviously get multiples in these, you know, habitat types of habitat with your dry heathland. You could even get some wet heath in certain depressions and parts of it, and then the dry acid grassland. So you can also then have woodland on the edge, and you can have a real mosaic of habitats within one space. So it's all about where your plot is going to lie. And obviously, as we've probably mentioned before, you don't want to have a situation where you have a plot that's covering 2 or more NPMS habitat types. You only want to be recording within one habitat type. So you'll sometimes need to rejig plot positions according to that. In terms of like management examples that you might be noting down when you're out on your survey, some of the examples are grazing is the most obvious one, just because of the fact that that's how these habitats are maintained primarily, although sun cutting is sometimes used. You're going to find a lot of cases it's sheep, cattle and ponies, but also rabbits as well. Lichen heaths and things are often rabbit grazed, places like Breckland, etc., rely heavily on rabbits as the management tool, really. And obviously you'll be looking out for usual signs, evidence of these animals, whether they've been grazing. You can also get obviously burning as a habitat tool, so it's worth sort of noting if you've got that. Something known as bracken bruising can happen in some certain places, which is just the act of repeatedly sort of crushing the bracken with mechanical tools on the back of a trailer or something. And that's just to sort of suppress the bracken growth. It's not very common, but you can have it. Lowland dry acid grassland survives generally on very steep rocky slopes where the soils are thin and the vegetation is open. So that can often happen. So where you've got sort of higher regions, but it's not above the 300 meters, but you've got that sort of happening as well. Also elements of scrub management. So whether they're cutting gorse or heather to create more open spaces. So examples of dry acid grassland, basically the main one that I come across personally is that mosaic with heathland, so it's sort of interspersed. We talked about the inland dunes there, but you can also get actual enclosed grazing pastures that are more of the dry acid community, perhaps of where they're situated and what the habitat used to be, but now it's become sort of maybe pony pasture. Even churchyards, if depending on their location, again, their underlying soils and geology, you can sometimes get dry acid grassland appearing in a churchyard. Road verges, similarly, it's all dependent on just really that soil type and underlying geology, and then that association of species that you get together. But you can have road verges that are dry acid grassland. Golf courses quite often have areas as well that are more like dry acid grassland, especially sort of the rough areas. And also things like disused airfields. So it's worth having a look if you've got, you know, you're new and you've got your NPMS 1 kilometre square and you're kind of trying to work out where you might find certain habitats. All of these sorts of things could be an example. The sort of likely grassland assemblages that you're going to have. So you could have something like lots of sheep's fescue and common bent, and then that early hairgrass, and then things like the sheep sorrel and the parsley peat. So that's quite a classic one. So it's all going to be those fine grasses again, and then you've got things like the sheep sorrel and the little parsley peat. Or maybe you've got something that's almost entirely dominated by wavy hairgrass or bristle bent and pretty much very little other species. So it's really species poor. And that can usually be maybe after there's been some burning, for example. Maybe you've got sheep's fescue and common bent again, this time with some red fescue and some sweet vernal grass in there. And then you've got some lovely little white flowers of Heath Bedstraw and yellow flowers of Tormental. That's quite a classic one that I come across a lot. Maybe you've got some stands of bracken, and then beneath the bracken, there are fescues and sweet vernal grass and all of those other species, but they're sort of lower growing and underneath the stands of bracken. So that's another one that you can have. And obviously there are varying degrees. Generally, it's the case that a lot of the sort of dry acid grassland I've come across is often species poor, but there are some examples, particularly Breckland again, some of the Dorset heaths, that sort of thing, where you've got some real sort of really high species number, sort of 25 species per meter square, that sort of thing. But yeah, quite a lot of them are species poor. So when is the best time and how? So again, this one is a plot size of 5 by 5 meters. You're not going to be doing a 10 by 10 meters because that's for woodland. However, it might be that if you have got the road verge that would come under dry acid grassland, then you're going to be doing the linear feature, so the you know, sort of 25 meter plot size length. How wooded is your plot? Generally speaking, you're not going to be finding many trees, although you can get the odd sort of a birch appearing, that sort of thing. And obviously it's about that scattered scrub could be an option, but as long as it's under the 25%. There's actually no grass species to identify at wildflower level for dry acid grassland. Woohoo, I hear you all saying. And there's only 3 species at indicator level to identify. So getting to know your plots for best timing. So for dry acid grassland, really between sort of April to July is your best sort of flowering period. So maybe sometime in May to go for your first survey, and then maybe the end of July for your second. There's not usually cuts and hay cuts to worry about, so that's not normally a problem with timings for surveys. But do be mindful of grazing animals and obviously burning activities if they are going on. It's worth saying that you know, dry acid grassland is has a tendency to, as the summer progresses towards August, get very, very burnt off and hot, and all the species become a bit brown and crunchy underfoot, and it can be quite difficult to identify. So it might be just worth bearing that in mind, particularly after the summer we've just had. So I always just go over this as just a quick reminder. So your vegetation height, you've got the 2 boxes there for your first and your second visit. And it doesn't have to add up to 100%. So you'll be mostly looking with dry acid grassland. A good example of dry acid grassland here on the image. You're going to be looking at those lower figure numbers and not so much the ones above 1 meter. And it's only an estimate, so don't worry. Yeah. So some of the species that we're going to try and cover over the next part of the session at the wildflower level are the following. So we're going to look at hard-fern, and we're going to look at Heath Bedstraw, sheep sorrel, that really characteristic one, wall speedwell and Heath Speedwell. And again, remember that some other species are either covered again, or some additional species are covered in Dominic Price's presentation that he did on this habitat type. So if we have a look at hard-fern first, it's a really beautiful fern, very, very characteristic, kind of distinctive, I would say. So that's quite useful that it's distinctive. Interestingly, it's one of the ones that has 2 different kinds of leaves or fronds. There are several different fern species that have these non-fertile and fertile fronds, but less obvious, I would say, on hard fern. You'd probably have to get down and start turning the leaves over and having a really good look at them. But essentially within the center of it, you're going to have ones with the sorry or the sporangi on the back, and the ones around the periphery are going to be the sterile fronds without anything on the back. Generally, the leaves are a really glossy, dark green, almost kind of have like that holly look to it. Glabrous, meaning so they don't really have any hairs or anything, giving that shiny appearance. The blade shape is lanceolate. As you can see from this image, they're not sort of bulging out in the middle anywhere, and generally a sort of very narrow tapering. They're only once pinnate, which means that you've got that 0 as the main one coming up and then the 1 coming across. So it's just 1 times pinnate. whereas a lot of our other ferns are obviously more pinnate than that. But then something like Hart's tongue fern is not pinnate at all because it's just that simple blade. So yeah, it's good to compare that. The pinnae, which are the individual sort of little leaflet bits that come off, are numerous and they are close together, and they themselves are also linear. So it gives that really distinctive look. Just a bit more of a closer up image. You can see how tightly packed they are, all these pinnae. And here's just a tiny young hard fern just unfurling, which is rather cute. But you can see how different it looks as it's first coming out. And then just to show you on the back, you have these sori, and they form a continuous line down the whole length of the pinna. So you can see them the way that they're forming this continuous line. And again, this is only going to be on those fertile fronds. So moving on to a real classic of dry acid grassland, your Heath Bedstraw. So this is really the same family as your goosegrass and your cleavers. And it's, you're not going to get a sort of marsh bedstraw up here. You're not going to get a hedge bedstraw necessarily. If you've got it very low growing and small leaves, then it's probably going to be the Heath bedstraw because it forms this kind of mat along the ground. The stems, they are hairless and four-angled and quite smooth, but with the four angles. They're quite branched, so that's creating that sort of mat-forming, sprawling effect. And the leaves themselves are mucronate, like a lot of the bedstraw families, which means they've got a sort of tiny little bristle tip to the end of the leaf. And obviously, like all the bedstraws, the leaves are in a whorl around the main stem. And they, some of the books will tell you exactly how many leaves sort of per whorl on average, but they often are all very similar, the sort of the bedstraw family. And importantly, they have prickles along the edge of the leaves, and those are forward pointing. So that can be quite a useful tip for some of the other bedstraw species that point in different direction. So you can see the tiny little flowers that are simple and white. And you can see that forming that lovely sort of effect with the sheep sorrel there. And then on this one, you can see, so we've got those four angled stems, and you can see the prickles. You can see the mucronate tip here, and you can see those forward facing prickles. But they're very, very small. As you can see, it's quite difficult to even make it out from this close up image. So it's not going to feel like madder or anything really, really rough or sharp. It's just, if you were to look with a hand lens, that's what you would see. So yeah, you can just see that. So sheep sorrel, that lovely one that we're saying is quite characteristic, that will give you that kind of red haze effect across the whole of the grassland. So it basically looks like a much smaller version of common sorrel. In general, the flowers and the way they're arranged, it's very similar, but they have narrower leaves and they are hastate shaped at the end. So you can see, we'll go into that on the next slide, but you can see this very distinctive shape at the base of the leaves, where they sort of form this, like, not an arrowhead so much, but it comes out and then they sometimes poke forward as well, whereas in common sorrel they would just be going downwards. And the side lobes of the are arrow shaped basically, but not like common sorrel. So this is just a young plant, not very good in focus of the flowers, apologies for that, but you can just see how it's kind of red tinged throughout. And here you can see a much older plant, just a dwarf version of common sorrel with those similar flowers, but the leaf shape is key. So to talk about the hastate shaped leaves. So common sorrel basically is sort of more your typical arrow shape going towards the stem, but your sheep sorrel often has these extra wing bits pointing upwards or backwards, but it doesn't mean every single one will, but it just has that slightly different shape to it at the base. So that's what it means when it says hastate shaped base. And then moving on now to Heath Speedwell, one of our two speedwells that are in as an indicator species. Again, this is wildflower level. Now they have the classic sort of speedwell flowers with the single stigma and the two stamen coming out. But they're quite different leaf shape to a lot of our speedwells. They're quite large leaves and rounded. And the whole sort of look of the plant is that they generally kind of almost, the leaves are creeping along the ground and can almost form like a kind of mat in an area, just sort of sending up their sort of racemes of flowers. So they're generally really hairy plant. You can see the stems on this one are hairy, the leaves are hairy, and the leaves are sort of an oval shape, but often quite folded in towards the middle like this. And the leaves themselves have very shallow teeth, if you look at them closely. And then the flowers are in these dense racemes here. And the actual flowers have got very, very, very short stalks on the actual raceme, whereas something like Germander Speedwell, you've got quite long stalks for the flowers. The corollas, so the flowers, the sort of themselves, are actually like a pale lilac color rather than one of the blues of some of the other Speedwells. So it's quite a pretty color. And generally they're quite large compared with something like time-leaved Speedwell. So you can really see how hairy the leaves are and that sort of oval shape and the size of the flowers there. Whereas the other species that we've got here, the wall Speedwell, which is an annual, so much more delicate, much smaller. It is also downy, so it's sort of less sort of bristly hairy, more sort of softly hairy when they say downy. And as I said, it's an annual species. The leaves are sort of an oval triangular shape. So instead of being that nice rounded oval, they slightly have a sort of triangular shape to them with these sort of coarse teeth rather than those minute little teeth, almost giving a sort of uneven toothed look. The racemes of flowers are terminal at the end of the flower, and the bracts are longer than the flowers themselves. So bracts is always a way of describing sort of extra leafy like parts of a plant that aren't true leaves, but they're not part of the sepals or anything to do with the actual flower structure itself. But they're essentially the bracts, which are these bits up here, are longer than the flowers. And importantly, the corollas are like a really blue color. So then you're not going to confuse it with the Heath Speedwell. You can just see how blue they are there. And you can see these oval sort of triangular, irregularly toothed leaves. And you can see those bracts and how big they are. They're almost sort of overtaking the flower head itself. And this is just one of the seeds within the fruits developing into the classic Veronica heart shape there. And this is just one of the sort of leaves higher up on the plant. So that was the only ones we were covering at wildflower level, because there's far more to cover at indicator level. So I thought we would only do a few at the wildflower level. And hopefully the idea is that if you're maybe recording at wildflower level, but you've kind of thought, I'd really like to have a go at indicator level at some point, then that's why it's really useful to go over these in a little bit of detail now so that you can come back to these videos, watch them, and then start recording your dry acid grassland at indicator level. It's worth pointing out at this point that you don't have to set your level for recording across all of your plots. If you wanted to, you could record certain plots and habitats at a certain level and some at others. So if you're very confident with something like woodland, then you could record that at indicator level, or even inventory if you wanted to. However, if you were less confident in something like grassland until you've developed your skills, you could record that at wildflower. So it's worth bearing that in mind. So we're going to cover the wavy hair grass and the sweet vernal grass. And then we've got a rush in there as well, heath grass, and then mat grass. So we're covering all the three grass species in this. And then we're going to do the lovely, one of my favorite plants, bird's foot, not bird's foot trefoil, but bird's foot. And then the two trefoils that we do have, hop trefoil and lesser trefoil. So first of all, we're going to do the sweet vernal grass, which is a really, really common grass. It's in many of our fine habitats. And it's often seen as a nice species to find, whether you're in sort of more of a meadow or maybe in the dry acid grassland. But they're generally a short-lived perennial species, and they are tufted and often reported to smell of new mown hay. So that would be if you were to sort of pick it up and crush it between your fingers. But again, that's going to be more likely at the beginning of the season than it is at the end when it's very dry. I personally, and I know other people have found this as well, if you pull it up from the very base, so almost from the roots, and you crush the base of the grass between your fingers, to me, it smells so much like TCP or like hospital smell. So just, you know, next time you do find that next year coming up, do sort of have a smell of it. But yeah, new mown hay or TCP, or either or. The leaves are, they're not, although dry acid grass, and we said about these fine leaved grasses, sweet vernal grass has fairly flat leaves, so not sort of that classic inrolled like something like the fescues, and it's generally quite thinly hairy all over. But one of the really distinctive things about sweet vernal grass is that the leaf sheaths, which is basically where the leaf is still encircling the stem of the grass before it comes out as a main leaf, have conspicuous sort of ring of hairs at the junction point with the blade. Also, the spike, the inflorescence is like a spike-like panicle, so it looks pretty much like a spike, but actually, if you were to sort of pull it apart, you'd see that there were little pedicels and that sort of thing. But it very much looks like a spike. So here it is sort of early in the season, when it's first sort of new growth, just finished, just starting to flower, looking quite fresh. Whereas at the end of the year, that's going to look very yellow and dry-like. Just a close up on those actual inflorescences. But here is that where you can see this sort of hair-like projections around at the sheath of the grass before it goes out. And you can also see on this image the sort of sparsely hairy nature of the leaf blades themselves. So just to sort of round off, we've got a spike-like panicle. We've got those long white hairs at the leaf stem or junction. Also, interestingly, there's a sort of extremely short awn, which gives a sort of hooked appearance on the spikelet. So when you were to pull those apart, that's how it looks. And yeah, so you can see it's also in dry montane heathland as well. Moving on then to wavy hairgrass. This is at the end of the season, so wavy hairgrass not looking at its best. So we've got several pictures to go through, but this is just to show that it can look quite a lot like other things as well. But you can see the sort of wavy pedicels. So that's the really important thing about wavy hairgrass. It has these wavy, zigzaggy stalks to the part of the inflorescence. Also, interestingly, they've got 2 florets per spikelet. So unlike the agrostis, they don't just have 1 flower, they have 2 flowers per little spikelet. And it's a fine and delicate grass, even sort of after it's finished flowering like this. But essentially, so that picture there is a better one of it sort of early in the season, looking lovely and sort of red tinged with the lighter coloured spikelets. But it's got a panicle which is branched but unequal, so it's not all kind of matched all the way around. And it's got these wavy or zigzag pedicels. That's a really important part of it. It's also worth noting that in our current guidance notes, well, in our species list and in our ID book, it's down as Deschampsia flexuosa, but it's actually changed fairly recently to Avenella. But yeah, just worth noting that. So you'll be recording it as Deschampsia on our forms, from the species list, but it has changed to Avenella. The leaves are kind of bristle-like and thin and enrolled and in dark green tufts, and usually much shorter than the inflorescences. And you can see that this one appears in quite a few of our NPMS habitats. So we've got it raised bog, all of the heathland and the marsh and fen for acidic as well. So yeah, appears in quite a few of our habitats. And yeah, just to re-emphasize that the spikelets, the actual florets inside there should be 2 florets per spikelet, unlike something like Bristle Bent, which could it be potentially confused with, which would only have the 1 floret per spikelet. So moving on now to our rush species, Heath Rush. The reason I've done it in this order is because this is the order it appears in your NPMS species guide. Rather than doing all the grasses together, I'm just going down literally in alphabetical order as per the scientific name. So Heath Rush, it's sort of a densely tufted species, and it's very wiry. So if you were to sort of feel the leaves and everything, it's got that sort of wiry feel to it. The leaves are all basal, so you're not having any leaves coming off from the stem itself. And all the leaves are very linear. They are very stiff, giving that wiry feel, and slightly reflexed as well, sort of in a certain direction. and the upper surface is deeply channeled as well. The flowers and fruit appear chunky, which is something I've added myself, and it's just a look about it. The flower heads and the fruiting heads look sort of very large in comparison to the rest of the plant compared with some of our other rush species, and it just has this really sort of chunky look about it. So not the greatest picture in the world, but you can see growing in amongst this ling here, and you can see some evidence of burning in the background. You can see you've got these classic sort of rush-like plants, but then these really sort of lumpy blobule-like flowering heads to them, whereas something like soft rush, it's going to be much more sort of almost like delicate than that. Up close, you can see just that these fruits and things, how that sort of large they are, and it has that real look to it. That should say it's quite a common one to find on heathland habitats, but also in the dry acid grassland. This species, mat grass, again, a lot of my photos of this species are at the end of the season when it's finished and it's dropped its seeds, but we have got other photos as well. But it's quite a classic one to find in acid grassland in the mosaic of heathland. It's also very, very common in the uplands. It's often can be quite dominant where perhaps there's been a lot of grazing, and it can sort of dominate the area. Again, it's another sort of wiry species and densely tufted. And the shoots are closely packed at the base of the plant. The leaves are tightly rolled and bristle-like, so another one that gives that sort of bristle-like appearance. But the inflorescence is quite different from some of the other species we've looked at so far, because it's a one-sided spike that can come across as green or purplish when it's flowering. You can see here when it's finished and it's opened out and all of the actual sort of seeds have fallen off, it almost looks like sort of a one-sided comb or sort of fern-like. And as I said, it increases with overgrazing. So here's a picture of it when it's actually sort of earlier in the flowering season, and you can see how it's got that purplish look to it. It could almost look from a distance, maybe like a mini purple moorgrass or something like that. But it's much, much smaller, and it's ligule, it's going to be membranous, and it's not going to be made of a ring of hairs like purple moorgrass. And yeah, it's just probably going to be found in slightly different habitat as well. Purple moorgrass tends to like it on the wetter side. And you can see that the leaves come out quite acutely from the base. That's another thing that it kind of creates this spread out effect. That's quite classic for it. And just to look at that inflorescence a bit closer. So it's a one-sided spike, which is quite interesting in itself. Now moving on to another one of our herb species. This is such a lovely plant. If you've ever seen it, then you'll know just how delicate and small it can be, which is difficult to get sort of an idea from the image. But it is obviously one of our pea family, and people often get confused when you say bird's foot and then you don't finish it off with trefoil, because it is not bird's foot trefoil. It's completely separate. It's bird's foot, Ornithopus I can't even say the bottom ones, there's no point. My lips will just end up in a muddle. But essentially, it's a beautiful, tiny little plant, and it's an annual. Quite often, as I said, a lot of the species that you get occurring in the dry acid grassland are annual species. And prostrate just meaning that it sort of creeps along the ground, sort of almost creating another mat in itself. The flowers are in small heads of sort of 3 to 6 flowers in a group, like a lot of our pea family. You know, they have clusters of flower heads. So you think about something like a clover with all of the flowers all sort of in one big head. Here it just has 3 or 6 flowers in one flower head. Interestingly, the leaves are basically like pinnate leaves, which are really, really sweet, sort of creating that classic little sort of all the way along, but really, really, really small. I mean, like that. And the flowers, yeah, 3 millimeters approximately, so very, very small. And they're sort of when you do get to look at them up close, they're sort of a creamy color with sort of red veins going along the standard petal at the back. The pods themselves, the reason it's called bird's foot is because the pods look so much like a bird's foot when they're spreading out, and they are curved and downy as well all over. And then each little pea is sort of constricted into these little jointed parts, which I've got a photo to show you. First of all, a close up of the flower, you can just see how beautiful and delicate that little one is. And here you can see those pinnate leaf arrangements, and then these constricted, sort of curved downy pods. You can see just how downy they are. And you can also see how freakily like a bird's foot it looks really as well. I think it's partly the sort of segmentation, looking like the sort of joints of the foot. But inside there, obviously, you'll have the little peas. So then hop trefoil, which is really quite a stunning little trefoil. And people often say, oh, how do you get, don't mix up hop trefoil and lesser trefoil. But when you've seen hop trefoil, really, really seen it, it's so distinctive because of the pattern and the way that the petals and that are formed on each little flower. It's difficult to get it confused, and it's much larger than lesser trefoil as well. It's generally another sort of sparsely hairy annual, but it can get quite sizable for an annual as well. And it has these globular flower heads with this standard petal, which you can just about make out here, that's sort of broad and flat and then bending forwards and downwards over the developing pods. And basically the whole sort of shape and arrangement basically looks like a hop cone, which is why it's called hop trefoil. So you can see a little bit closer here of that sort of arrangement of that standard petal kind of folding down and over, and how it creates this whole shape. And then as it dries over the developing pods, you can see it keeps that sort of shape there, but almost becomes even more down and more like a hop cone. Whereas lesser trefoil, although from afar you'd be like, oh, well, it's a cluster of little yellow flowers on a sort of trefoil-like plant, but actually it's a lot smaller than hop trefoil, and the cluster of flower heads is much smaller, and it is almost hairless as well, whereas hop trefoil was sort of generally quite downy. And that standard petal folds down either side of a sort of midline, a bit more like a ridged roof, a bit more classic pea shape in that sense. And then the pods are brown in fruit, which is obviously another way to sort of tell it apart from things like black medic. So black medic also looks very like lesser trefoil, and the two can easily become confused. But one of the things that it doesn't have, that black medic does, it doesn't have the mucronate little sort of bristle at the end of the leaf like black medic. It doesn't have that. But yeah, it's not hop trefoil because of the shape of the flowers and the size of it generally. So you can see just a close up here of the flower shape, and that standard petal is not sort of bending and folding over and creating that hop cone shape. So what I always say with any of the species that you come across, if you do need any help with identification, just remember to try and take some really good photos. It doesn't matter if you take 10 of them and you send all 10 of them to us, that's absolutely fine, because, the more the better really when it comes to trying to identify a plant. And try your best to get it into focus. Quite a lot of the smartphones these days have the option, if you press the center, then it will focus that part. And then take pictures of the flowers as well as the leaves and of the whole plant. And then make a note of how it was growing. Was it creeping, erect, or sprawling, that sort of thing? What was it like? And what is the other vegetation that it's near like? Was it growing in amongst rushes, or, was it growing in amongst bracken, that sort of thing? And was it dry, wet, or bare ground, or mossy, or that sort of thing? And the time of the year and the location that you found it. So different plants grow in different parts of the country. So yeah, different climatic conditions, that sort of thing. So I've sort of rounded up. What I would say is, obviously we're at the, we're now going into October, so everyone's probably finished with their surveys for this year and are thinking about data entry, hopefully furiously carrying on with that. But obviously the fact that this is recorded means that you can go on and watch it ready for next year's survey if you need to, and alongside Dominic Price's original one. So hopefully, we'll have covered enough of the species that you'll be able to feel confident enough. That's the plan anyway.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you very much, Sarah, for taking time at the start to help us with habitat identification, because actually, as you say, even though we're sort of towards the end of the season now, I doubt very much anybody will be heading out anytime soon until the next season. Now's a really good time to if you are new, to the scheme, or if you've got new plots, now's a really good time to get out and just start getting to know the areas, deciding where your plots are going to be, deciding on the identification of those habitats. So that was really useful. Thank you to kind of include in there how we actually identify the habitats.
Yeah.
It's not always super easy. So yes, certainly do spend this time over autumn and winter to get to know your square and the plots.
And do use that you know, that geology thing to get an idea of what sort of underlying soil types and bedrock that you have, because that can often be a real telltale of what kind of thing you're going to end up with, particularly grasslands. And I mean, you know, the thing with something like dry acid grassland, if you look at the official distribution of this habitat, it's incredibly sparse actually. It's a hugely declining habitat, mostly because of either intensification of agriculture and grazing, but also often something like the big grassy patches on the top of commons were viewed as being very low sort of fertile land, so they were often used for development, so we've lost a lot of them through that. And it can be quite a difficult habitat to manage as well. Interestingly, there's been quite a lot of research into the reason for the species sort of richness declining, and that's been linked to atmospheric pollution, quite a lot of it. So kind of going out there and monitoring these habitats with NPMS is actually a really great way of kind of, you know, us keeping an eye on that sort of thing.
If you do have anything else you'd like to ask, by all means do get in touch. But thank you ever so much, Sarah.
No, that's all right. Thank you everyone for listening, and yeah, see you at the next one.
Yeah, perfect. And thank you ever so much, everybody, for your efforts. That's brilliant. And getting out there and collecting the data and of course, importantly, submitting it. So see you all soon. I'm sure I'll be in touch very soon.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.